Welcome everybody to another exciting episode of Under the Dome. I'm your host, Allen Ulrich. Bob will be joining with us shortly. He is right now finishing a story about the latest addition to the Saints roster, Jonathan Abram, former first-round pick, safety. The Saints just signed about a half hour ago. And they also brought back Malcolm Roach. Roach had said he wanted to test free agency. I think he thought he could get the kind of money that his former teammate Shai Tuttle had gotten. And I think pretty quickly people realized, he's not Shai Tuttle. He wasn't a starter. He was a rotational guy who barely got any snaps. And he came back to the Saints instead of a 2-year deal. He signed a 1-year deal, hoping to get more snaps and maybe get the money next year. So as soon as Bob finishes up his story, turns it in, he'll be jumping in here in just a few minutes. In the, what's this? Need a what? A CO? Oh, co-host? No, we're good. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. No, Bob's going to be on in just a few minutes. Yeah, Jerry is a good pickup. Yeah, Bob's all over the place, honestly. He is on his regular show, the Bayou Blitz. He's on this show as the permanent co-host. He appears on a radio show with Jody. I cannot think of his name. Jody Hurtley. It's an ESPN radio program. So he gets around. Me, I have to work in the regular world, and this is my escape, actually. So in the meantime, let's talk about a couple of the other pickups that the Saints had. Well, of course, the Saints signed 2 big defensive tackles last week, and they also brought in the guy I really want to focus on, and he was on the picture today, Jamal Williams, the former Green Bay Packer, Detroit Lion running back. He led the league last year in 17 touchdowns, and in his press conference, he talked about that a little bit. He kind of mocked the fact that his critics were saying, but they were all 1-yard goal line rushing touchdowns. Well, if you look back at the Saints season last year, how many times did the Saints fail to convert 2nd and 1, 3rd and 1, unless Taysom Hill ran those plays? They convert a 3rd and 1 against Tampa Bay. There is no comeback for Tom Brady, and the Saints probably can win that division. I'm glad to have a guy who can run the 1 yard when you need a yard. I'm glad to have what was it that the former Dallas Cowboys fullback, not Robert Newhouse, the tough guy, the old cowboy. What was his name again? It was. It'll come back to me. Anyway, his reputation was, if you need 3 yards, I'm gonna get you 3 yards. If you need 15 yards, I'm gonna get you 3 yards. I can deal with a guy like that, and I still think that the running back position is going to be a target in the draft. I also think defensive line is still going to be a target in the draft. I think tight end will be a target in the draft, despite them hosting Foster Monroe this past weekend, the former LSU Tiger and Raiders tight end. So, there's still a lot of moves they can make. And the good thing about getting these free agents is, thank you, Walt Garrison. Thank you. I could not think of his name. I could picture him. I knew his jersey number, and I just couldn't think of who he was. He cut his and uh, but I'm sorry, guys. I usually have strong internet in this house when I'm not doing this broadcast. When I'm doing this broadcast, my internet seems to go crazy, and I apologize about that. Anyway, I'm not surprised, Calvin. My thing though, if you sign Foster, the tight end, that really is a challenge for Adam Trotman, because Trotman and he are basically the same guy. Trotman is a poor man, Josh Hill. Trotman is someone who is going to be mainly a blocker. He can catch some passes, but if you have to rely on him too much to catch passes, he's not going to. Yeah, maybe they are. If you catch too many passes, he's just going to frustrate you, because he just simply is not that level of player. And that's why he'll still be a target on the draft, regardless of who they bring in. Look, there's Bob. Off of working on your story. I would say the ink hasn't even dried yet, but I'm just dating myself by saying that. How you doing, Bob?
I'm hanging in there. The voice is still coming and going, so y'all have to bear with me tonight. But the New Orleans Saints are keeping us pretty busy on the news wires these days.
I was just saying, that here we are. We're just before we go on air, the Saints signed Jonathan Abram, and then they go and re-sign Malcolm Roach. So, yep. This is not this for a team that was 50+ million over the cap. They spent a lot of money. They've reorganized restructured a lot of contracts, and they've brought in a lot of players. It looks like, and I knew this was going to happen, Mickey is going to give Dennis Allen whatever he needs to build a team. This is not going to be Sean Payton's team any longer. Is that how you see all these moves?
Yeah, that's absolutely how I see it. And not only on the field, but on the sidelines too. Like you said, Mickey Loomis and Gail Benson, have allowed Dennis Allen to build the team how he wants it. And regardless of how you feel about how Dennis Allen did as a coach last year, I feel anyway, like the man deserves a chance to coach his team, his coaches, his choice of players, et cetera. And this is you've got to also believe that from Loomis and Benson's standpoint, that this is definitely a sink or swim year for Dennis Allen. They turn in another lethargic 7-10 type of season, with the coaches that he picked and the free agents that he hand selected. Then we're not even having a conversation about if Dennis Allen should be fired at the end of the year. That's the way I'm looking at it.
I agree with that. I mean, he's now established 7-10 as the floor, and his job is to get back to the playoffs. The division is even weaker than it was last year with Tom Brady on. It's quite obvious that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, if not tanking, are in a rebuilding mode. And that's another coach that's in hot water, that's probably in a hot seat. But they're not building a team for him. It looks like they're going to torpedo this season and probably send him out with it and go for a full rebuild next year. I mean, it's amazing how little Tampa has done other than sign Baker Mayfield. They've let more talent walk out of that building than kept.
Yeah, exactly. They are doing what the national media has been wanting the Saints to do for honestly the last 4 years. And I think it's very obvious that that Mickey Loomis right up through ownership, they're not built that way. They come into every year with the mentality of we're going to try to put the most competitive team that we can on the field, whether you guys feel that that's the type of team that could pursue a championship or not is irrelevant. That's what we feel can compete for a playoff spot, or God forbid a Super Bowl championship. And that's I love the mentality. I know they take a lot of criticism from a certain faction of New Orleans fans, but those fans, that's mostly the younger generation. The older the more experienced fans like you and I, we would have killed for that kind of mentality way back in the day, in the early and even mid 80s.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the decline of the Jim Moore era, and you look at the Ditka era. The Saints were a team that let a lot of talent walk out the door. In 93 and 94 and even 95, the Times-Picayune was running a story or a paragraph every Sunday, every Monday, ex-Saint of the week. And it would be a profile or whatever, a former Saint player that is now on another team, what he is doing, especially when the Saints lose. So we're actively campaigning to get rid of Moore or to change that mentality of, you're letting all this talent walk out the door and you're not replacing it with good players.
And you look at that era that you're talking about. Forget the Mecomb days, where they jettison players like George Rogers, Galbraith, Muncie, Chandler, etc. Let's look at the end of the Mora era and even through Hazlitt. The type of players that left that building: Pat Swilling, Ricky Jackson, Quinn Early, even Bobby Hebert, then later on Willie Rofe, Sam Mills, Leroy Glover, all of those guys, and I mean every single one of the players that I just mentioned, had several very, very good seasons with other teams. Over the last handful of years with the Saints, can you name me 4, 5 Saints players that left the organization and had success? Malcolm Jenkins comes to mind. Brandon Cooks to a certain extent. Trey Hendrickson, Von Bell, obviously. But my point is the list is short.
Yeah. And then it's not to the level. I mean, granted, Malcolm Jenkins and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson both went to a Super Bowl, but it's not to the level of disconnect that you had where the Saints were replacing these great players with inferior players.
Mm-hmm.
Players that weren't nearly as good at anything. And that's what you saw during the end of the Moore era. And that's what you saw during the Ditka years and so forth, where you saw, Winfred Tubbs, and I'm thinking specifically about the Ditka era. Winfred Tubbs has a Pro Bowl season, has a breakout year as a middle linebacker, the first solid middle linebacker to the 4-3 defense that they had, probably going back to Joe Fettisfield, because we can't really count, Sam Mills and Vaughn Johnson, Doc Kovac, and those guys, because that was a 3-4 defense. When Bun Phillips arrived, they switched to a 3-4 defense. So when they went back to the 4-3 after they got rid of Steve Sidwell in the mid 90s under Moore, they struggled at middle linebacker. So, you ended up finally getting a good linebacker. Winfred Tubbs has his breakout year, and Ditka lets him leave the building, and they start working with, lesser talent again until Hazlitt comes in and gets Mark Fields and gets Keith Mitchell but he still had a problem with middle linebacker because he couldn't get a consistent middle linebacker. And we never had a consistent middle linebacker again until Jonathan Vilma.
Mm-hmm.
That's a heck of a stretch. I've heard stories about this. And this has a lot to do with dysfunction in the locker room in 2001. But he's still one of my all-time favorite Saints players. It's funny, a lot of my favorite Saints players have this kind of scandal about them. Chuck Muncie was one of my favorite players. Wes Chandler was one of my favorite players. Pat Swilling, Joe Horn, Leroy Glover. Each time it seemed like Jimmy Graham. It seems like there's something else about me. Michael Thomas right now. There's always something about some of these guys that I love, and I think you become such a star and such a great player that you almost supersede the team sometimes if you're not careful. And I think that happened with guys like Joe Horn and maybe to an extent with Leroy Glover, but some of that stuff has to go happens. So
and I agree.
Right.
Yeah, there were personal issues, with Glover. Certainly personal issues with Brandon Cooks, and you're right, Anna, about him moving on to Dallas. There was a contract dispute that was on the verge of getting ugly with Pat Swilling. Same with Willie Rofe. It's not like the Saints just kicked these players to the curb. But the point that Allen was kind of making is, when you have star players like that, more often than not, if you're a winning organization, you need to find a way to keep them in the building. And if you don't, then you better get a big haul for them in return. Like when they traded Pat Swilling, they ended up getting draft picks, and one of them ended up being Willie Rofe. That kind of thing. And if you are a winning organization, you can't afford to let your stars constantly leave, regardless of what the problems are. You need to find a way to work things out with them. You can't have a revolving door where you develop talent, and then as soon as they get an ego that's a little bit too big, especially in this generation. Then you just go ahead and let them walk for absolutely nothing. Winning teams don't do that consistently.
Speaking of guys with big egos who walked away for practically nothing, let's talk a little bit about Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Okay, so Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, CD Deuce, wanted to get a big contract with the Saints. He didn't get it. We traded him, got some late day 3 picks. The Eagles essentially got him for a 1-year rental because they weren't going to pay him the money he was looking for. And he went on the open market. They gave them the money that Chauncey was looking for to Bradbury, Darius Slay. So I think he realized he wasn't getting paid for them. But he goes to the Lions. Now, granted, there's familiarity because Aaron Glenn's a defensive coordinator, and you have the head coach and Campbell. Both are guys that he's been around, so he knows this kind of system. But he only got a 1-year deal for about 10 million, 9 million. I think it was 8 was guaranteed. So he still didn't get his big payday. What does that tell you about him, or does it say anything?
It tells me that his personality makes teams uneasy, at least to the point of paying him a long-term deal. That's why the Saints were reluctant to do it, which resulted in the temper tantrum and the dysfunctional behavior that basically forced the Saints to trade him to Philadelphia. I think I certainly did, but I think a lot of us knew all along that Philly was just looking at Gardner-Johnson as a rental player. And you could say that it worked out. I mean, he led the league in interceptions. They made a Super Bowl run. But you also knew that Philadelphia was never going to pay those that kind of number, that Gardner-Johnson and his agent were wanting. And like you said, he tested the market. The safety market was a little bit watered down as far as dollars, this year, which frankly surprised me. And Gardner-Johnson basically hit the reset button by signing with Detroit on a 1-year deal. Gambling on himself, and it's a good gamble because he's certainly a good player. But he's gambling that if he has another big year, and maybe he keeps his mouth shut, and helps himself out in spite of himself, that maybe he could get bigger money on the open market next year, when the salary cap is again estimated to inflate probably by as much as $10 million per team. So so I see the reasoning from Chauncey Gardner-Johnson's point of view, but I'm also not surprised that things unfolded this way. And I'm also not surprised he took some shots, some verbal shots at the Eagles organization on his way out the door. It's what he did with the Saints. It's what it's the type of personality that he is. And it's that kind of personality that makes teams a little bit uneasy about shelling out that 4-year, $80 million type of contract to a player with such a volatile personality.
Absolutely. That's how I see it too. I see it as he's betting on himself, and teams are reluctant to. He's not going to get the Marcus Williams contract, which is kind of what he was looking for. A corner top safety kind of contract, and they just don't see him that way. They see him as a roving player who probably works best in the nickel, not so much as a single high safety, someone who can just make plays out there. So you're looking at how much you're going to pay you per snap and things. And yeah, his personality is a turnoff for teams because you don't know what kind of personality it's going to be. We had said, I'm talking about we as Saints fans were saying that when Gardner was here, that, you would love to have Chauncey Gardner on your team, but you would hate to play against him because he would aggravate you. And then you'd hate to be a fan of the team playing against his team because he would just piss you off. And I think that's the personality he's carrying into the business side, which when he started giving the Saints coaches lip, I'm like, that's going to get around. And teams see that, and they're not going to want to deal with him because you don't have a Jerry Glanville. You don't have an Al Davis and John Madden anymore in the NFL. The NFL is very, very strict and very rigid about the kinds of players they want to have now because there's so much money involved and there's a salary cap to deal with. You're not willing to take the chances on questionable players like the Raiders did in the 70s and things like that. They just don't want to deal with that. Anna points out, Brandon Cook's been passed around like a credit. You got a first-round pick for him. The Patriots got a first-round pick, and now he's going for day 3 picks. And the funny thing is, he is a productive receiver. Yeah. But I think it's his size that really turns teams off to him because he really can't be an X or a Y receiver. He's really got to be a slot receiver.
Yeah, especially at this point in his career. Early on, mainly his days with the Saints, he could have been, he was a productive number 2 guy, as long as you have that big physical guy, to complement him, which they did in Michael Thomas. But Brandon Cooks was never a number 1 receiver, but he expected the targets of a number 1 receiver. Brandon Cooks now at this point in his career, like you said, he's not a number 2 guy anymore. He's a number 3, a guy that works best out of the slot, or one that you can move around the formation, because he isn't your offense's primary target.
Yeah. Matt asked, would Terrell Owens and Chad Ochocinco last in today's NFL? They would, because they didn't take shots at ownership. They took shots at teams, but not owners, or players and not owners.
Yeah, and Terrell Owens late in his career, taking shots at the quarterback wouldn't have flown. But through most of his 49er days, which were his most productive days, other than that 1 year with Philadelphia, Terrell Owens was actually the good soldier, at least publicly. So I agree with you, Alan. I think Chad Johnson. I'll never call him Ochocinco. Chad Johnson, Terrell Owens, those type of guys, they would last because their arrogance, their personality, was a little bit different than a Chauncey Gardner-Johnson or an Antonio Brown, type of player. And remember, once Antonio Brown couldn't contain himself anymore, that's when he started getting passed around, and cut by teams, or leaving teams in the middle of the year. John, and I know that this is going to strike some people the wrong way, but C.J. Gardner-Johnson's personality, almost from day one, reminded me of Antonio Brown.
Just
Rose.
Yeah, we both froze. You were saying about Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. You said something about what teams saw in him from day one, and then it kind of froze. What were you saying?
I said that Chauncey Gardner-Johnson's personality, from day one, reminded me a little bit of Antonio Brown. I watched Antonio Brown's career pretty closely up in Pittsburgh. I have a friend who is in the Steelers organization even to this day. And I asked him about AB once, and he said, he told me, no, he goes, it had nothing to do with CTE or any of that BS. Antonio Brown has always been a dick, and it didn't get out of control until he started getting paid, and until coaches and the leeches, the entourage that hangs on to guys like that, when he stopped being held accountable by the locker room for his antics and his speaking out, he just got more and more and more out of control. And that's frankly what I saw, the kind of personality that I see out of Chauncey Gardner-Johnson.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. I was thinking of a guy like Lyle Alzado would not last in today's league.
No.
No, granted, the drug test, he probably flunked all the drug tests for
Right.
the steroids. But even if he didn't have the steroids, a 3 mile, and I think that's when you look at a guy like Ndamukong Suh, you see how often he gets passed around. And he's kind of become that mercenary player who joins a team just for a Super Bowl run.
Mm-hmm.
And teams are willing to put up with him for a few weeks, but they're not going to put up with him long term because they know it's only a matter of time before he blows his top and becomes a problem for your team. So they just sign him for these short-term deals. So, yeah, I mean, you see examples of this in today's league. So I kind of talked a little bit about Jonathan Abram. Can you talk a little bit about without telling your whole article, what do you see him doing with the Saints? And then we could talk about the other cornerback / safety, Johnson, that the Saints signed yesterday.
What I see from Abram, if the Saints coaches use him to his strengths, he's an in-the-box safety. His playing style is a lot like Malcolm Jenkins. Malcolm Jenkins, even in his prime, you never wanted Malcolm in one-on-one coverage. You didn't want him as a single high safety. You wanted him, Malcolm Jenkins I'm talking about. You wanted him, if in coverage duties, it was as a double high safety where he had pretty good instincts, but mainly you wanted him in the box. That's what kind of player Jonathan Abrams is. Now, Abrams does not have Jenkins' size, but he'll bring the lumber. He can hit you. He has nice instincts against the run, but very, very stiff in pass coverage. Very, very poor instinctually back there. Frankly, if the Saints say the Saints add a safety in the draft, and it's as high as the middle rounds, Jonathan Abrams might have a hard time making this team because he doesn't have the versatility that Dennis Allen likes to see in his defensive backs. Now, I mean, if you look at the depth chart as it stands right now, right here tonight, Abrams would make the team. But like I said, it's then on the coaches to use him to his strengths. So on the field, you want a guy like that in the box as much as possible. He kind of serves the role of an extra linebacker. Again, a lot like Malcolm Jenkins did for this defense.
Right, exactly. And Lane Johnson or Johnson, the cornerback slash safety from Tennessee, former Chief as well, and former Texan, I'm sorry, as well, that the Saints signed yesterday. How do you see him?
Lonnie Johnson is the anti Jonathan Abram. He is exactly the type of defensive back that Dennis Allen likes. Lonnie actually played some wide receiver early on in college. And since he's been in the NFL, he's played slot. He's even played boundary corner a little bit. He's been a single high safety, free safety, strong safety inside the box. He's a little bit smaller guy. But much more athletic, much better in coverage. Hence his roles in the slot. Again, he's not a guy you want in man-to-man coverage, but he has good instincts, good ball instincts, and off-ball coverage. You know who he reminds me of? He reminds me a lot of P.J. Williams, which. Yeah. Given the fact that the Saints have for the last 4 years brought back PJ on 1-year contracts, now they sign a guy like Lonnie Johnson, a guy that can do all those same things that PJ Williams could do. It does make you wonder if PJ Williams' days as a Saint are finally over, because again, Lonnie Johnson will serve. Looking at this depth chart the way we see it tonight, Lonnie Johnson would serve all the same kind of things that PJ Williams did for this defense.
Okay, then there were a couple other signings that happened that were, I call them below the radar, but they could be something significant. The Saints signed Ty Summers, a linebacker. Seems like really a special teams guy. Not anyone's going to replace Caden Ellis. Certainly not a guy who's going to be a starter. As well as Storm Norton, the right tackle from the Chargers. And I was reading some of the Chargers stuff on Twitter, and you take that for what it's worth, but they're all like, yeah, good luck with you. We're glad to be ready. He's kind of, I guess, their version of Andres Pete. They were more than happy to offload this guy. But I mean, again, he's not looking to be a starter. It's just somebody they were looking to bring in. So can you give like a thumbnail sketch of these guys?
Storm Norton is a late bloomer. He's a guy that kind of bounced around the league when he first got here. As a mid-round, late-round draft pick. He even did a stint in one of the attempts that the XFL threw out there. But then in 2021, Storm actually started, I think, 15 games for the Chargers. And he appeared in 12 or 14 games last year, not as a starter, but basically as a swing lineman. What I've seen about from Storm Norton is that he is a very physical run blocker. He's a phone booth guy. In other words, he's that type of guy that athletic rushers, athletic defenders will give him all kinds of trouble because he struggles with his footwork. But if he gets his hands on you, if he's asked to just fire straight out in the trenches, he can beat the hell out of different defenders. And the fact that you're right, he played mostly right tackle with the Chargers, but he has done some work at left tackle as well throughout his career, which means that he brings the type of versatility that the Saints want out of their offensive linemen. They always, and I mean without exception, always want their backup offensive linemen to be able to play multiple positions, even if it's just both tackle spots. You look at Storm Norton. He looks like a guy to me that Sean Payton used to love to bring, and we even saw it with Dennis Allen and Pete Carmichael last year. They always like to bring an extra offensive lineman in on those goal line situations and short yardage situations. That's what kind of guy Storm Norton is. You don't want him starting long term, especially at tackle, because again, he is going to be, the longer he's out there, the more he's going to be exposed by pass rushers. But if you put him in a running situation, in a short yardage situation, he'd be able to excel. He'd be able to play reasonably well if one of your tackles got nicked up during a game and he had to finish out that game. So, I mean, he's that kind of guy. I think that that's a stronger signing than what people think, especially when you consider the amount of injuries that the offensive line has had to deal with the last 2 years.
Absolutely. That's how I look at it, too. I mean, Calvin Throckmorton is a nice backup player, but you don't want him out there. And you look at like last year, we're starting to sign guys in off the street. to fill in for injuries and things like that. You need to have some veteran players, but young and inexpensive veteran players to come in and kind of serve as your backup players. I don't remember exactly if we talked about these two guys or not. I think we did. I don't remember when Sanders and Shepard were both signed. Was that on Wednesday or the first day of free agency, or was that Tuesday before the
It was on Wednesday when you and I last spoke officially. They had lost Onyemata and Tuttle, so we expected. We expected signings at defensive tackle, but I don't think it happened before we went on the air for this show last week.
Yeah, I don't think it was. And I was really just trying to see if I remember talking about these guys, but I do remember the signing. So yeah, it's been a fast week. So let's talk about those two guys, Shepard and Williams, because these are guys. No, sorry, Williams, Saunders. Sorry. Shepard and Saunders. These are guys that have probably seen significant snaps. Yeah, thank you, man. I figured. Sorry. I knew it wasn't Sanders either, but I said it anyway. These are guys I think that are going to see significant snaps, regardless of what happens in the draft. You're looking at two guys who are basically probably going to be the replacements for Onyemata and for Tuttle. Saunders, I'm impressed with. Saunders, that's a guy I think is an upgrade. Shepard, on the other hand, he's a question mark. He's got something to prove. I mean, granted, you're coming from the Jets, but the Jets have a good head coach that's defensive-minded. What are your impressions of these two guys?
I really like both signings. And don't get me wrong, I always liked David Onyemata as a player. I like Shai Tuttle as a player too for what he could do. But when you compare Saunders and Shepard as a duo, I actually think that they're a potential upgrade over Onyemata and Tuttle as a duo. Athletically, Saunders is every bit the athlete that Onyemata was. And remember, Onyemata was considered a freak. Onyemata is probably a better pass rusher as far as a repertoire of moves compared to Saunders, but I think Saunders is probably the more accomplished run defender. Shepard, I agree with you. Shepard's the less notable name of the two, probably because Kansas City's been at a high level for so long. But I think it's very interesting that the Saints are actually paying Shepard more than what they signed Saunders for. Now, granted, the totals are very close, but I thought that was noteworthy. And Shepard has always shown a good natural ability to rush the passer. He was a little bit slow to develop as a run defender. Last year, if you're to believe PFF grades, and I take those with a grain of salt, but you just look at the Jets' defensive line in general, at how well they performed. Shepard against the run and the pass. Shepard was very much a part of that. He played. His snap count last year was a career high, so I think he's a player that's trending upward. Saunders too. Saunders took on more of a leadership role in that Kansas City defense last year. Also saw, if I'm not mistaken, a career high snap count. So, I agree with what you said. Both of these guys are going to be expected. They're not going to be role players for this defensive line. They're expected to, if not start, then at least be a significant part of the rotation. I still believe that the Saints will draft a defensive tackle in the first or second day of the draft. So, in other words, fairly early. I think Malcolm Roach coming back is key because you still have to fill out that interior rotation. But the fact that Saunders and Shepard were the first two pieces of that rotation tells you how strongly the Saints coaching staff feels about them.
Speaking of the draft, then, do you think that it will be more of a 3 technique that they try and draft in the first round, or a 0 technique or a nose guard that they'll be looking for?
Alan, I've been back and forth on that. As far as your penetrator, you got to look at a guy like Cansey from Pitt, who I know everybody has fallen in love with. I'll be attending his pro day at the end of the month, but I've got my eye more on the big body, the big beef in the middle. Ika from Baylor, former LSU kid, and Mozzie Smith from Michigan. Both of those guys tipped the scales at 330. 330 plus. And they. Remember that the Saints finished 24th against the run last year, and that was largely because of massive struggles inside. I still believe that this team is going to run a base 4-man front because that's what Dennis Allen does. That's the strength of this roster, strength of Cam Jordan, and that's what Joe Woods does. Throughout his history as a defensive coordinator. But you still need that big beef in the middle. And even though Shepard and Saunders are both over 300, they're each a lanky 300, if there is such a thing. Because they're on like 6'3", 6'4" frames. Mozzie Smith and Ika, they're those spark plug guys. They're the guys that in the old Steelers Blitzburg 3-4 Dom Capers scheme. Dom Capers always needed that nose tackle that could that was the size of 3 brick walls. Those are these guys. And that's kind of where I'm leaning towards the Saints going in the draft, because they just don't have that size in the middle, and really haven't since Malcolm Brown left.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in that mindset too. I'm phrase heavy lunch bunch, but I think that Dennis wants to get some meat in that middle. Because he sees himself having a lot of pass rushers, and then when he can go to the long distances, the 3rd and 7 and longer, he can go and kick. Don't laugh, but he can go and kick Peyton Turner and Passino inside and run the old NASCAR package.
Yeah,
and have guys have all 4 pass right there. I'm looking at it in terms of, I want to make it 2nd and 10 or 2nd and 9, and I want to make it 3rd and 7. I want to take that run away so it's not 2nd and 4 or 2nd and 2, and they can run their whole playbook. I want to make it predictable because I want to get turnovers. I'm looking for turnovers from this defense, and I think like Calvin said, you get a big guy in the middle, a Norman Hand, a Malcolm Roach, someone like that inside that just shuts down the run, takes up 2 blockers, and frees up things for everybody else. And I'm leaning that way too. At the same time, in the back of my head, I'm thinking the whole time, but I need somebody who pushes that pocket in the middle, because those running quarterbacks, that's what they hate. They hate having pressure come up the middle, because it makes them look down at the rush and they make one read, tuck down, and then they go. And they don't want to get involved in that. If they get to sit back there and take their time and make their reads, it's because their tackles can block out our ends. They've got a pocket to step up in, and if the hole opens up, then they'll take off running. That's what I do not want to see again this year.
But like you, at the same time, like you said, a guy like Mozzie Smith or Siaki Ika, they're not going to be mistaken for Aaron Donald type of pass rush production anytime soon. But if they could just tie up blockers and just push that pocket, and blockers straight back into quarterbacks, even mobile quarterbacks, that makes them feel uncomfortable. The most productive David Anya has ever been during a season as a pass rusher was when he had Malcolm Roach and when he had Sheldon Rankins beside of him doing that kind of thing. So therefore, and don't get me wrong, I love Cansey. I'm a little bit I'm a lot iffy on Barisi, the Clemson defensive tackle, but I'd rather have that big slobber knocker inside, because I think guys like that can make signings like Saunders and Shepard, all the more effective, can add years onto Cam Jordan's career, increase the effectiveness of Passanio and Granderson on the other side.
Absolutely. So I am leaning towards that as well. Good say, because I was just getting ready to go there. So now we lost Caden Ellis. So you really have Demario Davis and you have Pete Werner, who Werner's been injured a lot in his brief career so far as a Saint. Are you concerned about linebacker right now?
Personally, no. But that's only because I have had confidence in DeMarco Jackson since the day they drafted him. Whether the Saints feel that way or not, we'll find out probably in the draft. Because they didn't make a strong attempt to re-sign Caden Ellis. I don't think they had any plans to sign him for the type of deal that Caden ended up getting from Atlanta. When you do look on paper, it is concerning if Demario Davis starts to show his age, and starts to go downhill a little bit. What if DeMarco Jackson, and he was only a 5th-round pick from from little tiny Appalachian State, so I'm way out on a limb here when I say I have a lot of faith in him. What if he isn't ready to step up? Then I don't see any linebackers that would really be a great fit as far as plug and play, dynamic type of guys for the Saints to select in the 1st round. But I think that this organization would be foolish if they aren't turning over stones to try to find some athletes at the position to at least round out the depth chart.
Yes, I am extremely concerned, and that people think that maybe we can try and use Zach Bond as they use Caden Ellis as kind of that pass rushing linebacker. I think Caden Ellis has more awareness than Bond did as a pass coverage, run responsibility. Bond is definitely a guy that just wants to pin his ears back and go after that quarterback. And I think that leaves him exposed in a lot of ways, and teams took advantage of that pretty quickly. Now, I don't know how much more he's learned since then, but when he got the starting job in the beginning of his career, it seemed like that's what he was doing a lot. The longer he was out there, the more teams were going to isolate him to get him matched up in pass coverage or confuse him in play action pass. I agree with that, Brian, to an extent. Bond, unfortunately, is a 3-4 linebacker. And a 3-4 linebacker in the old just go rush the passer in a defense like a Blitzburg defense. But he's short. He's not that 6'4 linebacker like a Pat Swilling or Ricky Jackson, or when we're going back to the Blitzburg era, Kevin Green, guys like that. He's not built like that. He's rather short and stocky, which makes him tough to be a defensive end. It works in college football, but it doesn't work on the pro ball.
Well, that's the thing, and a lot of people don't realize that the defensive system that Bond produced so well in at Wisconsin, they often ran a 5-man front. And Bond was basically a stand-up defensive end, which converts to a pro defense, to an NFL defense, exactly like you said, a 3-4 defense with those tall, thinner guys coming off of the edge. That worked for Bond in college, but it was never going to be a good fit for the New Orleans Saints type of defense. Because he's too small, too lightweight to play defensive end. He's not athletic or aware enough to play an outside spot, especially in a traditional 4-3 or 4-2-5 defense. So really almost any time he's out there, unless it's a 3rd and long situation where you just, like you said, where you just say, go get the quarterback. Any other situation that Zach Bond is on the field, in the Saints defensive scheme, he's going to be a liability in space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I am, with that in mind, I am nervous about the position, because Allen has played much more of a 4-3 defense than he did under Peyton, which was more of a 4-2 with a big nickel, safety corner hybrid playing that outside linebacker. So it's a bit of a concern. I'd like to a strong side linebackers that somebody I'm probably in round 3 or 4. The challenge though for this is I know who everybody has targeted in round 3. Every single mock draft I have seen from a Saints fan has Spears from Tulane going in round 3 to the Saints. So
that's not and I love Spears, but that's not the Tulane kid I want on this team. Tulane kid I want is Dorian Williams, the linebacker from Tulane. He's a player, a lot of that same skill set as Demario Davis has, and he could come off the board as early as the 3rd round, probably more of a 4th or 5th round prospect. But I see why people love Spears, and I'd love for that to happen. But I think Dorian Williams is a better fit for this New Orleans Saints team and what they need right now.
It'll be very interesting if Spears is on the board and the Saints do take the linebacker from Tulane in the 3rd round, what the reaction would be. Because I agree with you. There were several linebackers I like in this draft, but they're mostly, like you said, they're mostly 2nd and 3rd round picks. So I'm really curious how this draft shakes out. But yeah, I'm looking at strong side linebackers or linebackers that can cover tight ends, and also I'm looking at middle linebackers too, because Warner does have issues with staying healthy. There are some concerns. Free agency is not that strong, linebacker. So it'll be interesting. Let's just leave it at that. When we get close to the draft, we'll target some other areas. Let's talk about one other area, because I do want to get your thoughts on Jamal Williams as well. But tight end. So I was talking about them hosting Foster Moreau right before you came on. If he signed by the Saints, it probably is a bad thing for Adam Trautman, because chances are Trautman will not be here if Moreau is here, because they're basically the same linebacker. They're not the pass catching threat. Number one, do you see them signing Foster from the Raiders? And number two, do you still see them targeting a tight end in the draft?
If one happens, then 2 won't. In other words, if they sign Moreau, and I do think it's a reasonable possibility, depending on his contract demands, because Foster's already visited, including the Saints, 4 or 5 different teams. So depending on his contract demands, it wouldn't be a bad signing. Obviously, he's very familiar with Derek Carr. He's played every year of his career with Carr as his quarterback. And I think the comparison with Adam Trautman is a good one, other than the fact that Foster Moreau is a more accomplished receiver, has the athleticism to get downfield and make plays a little bit better than Trautman. Juwan Johnson is still the the best athlete of that position group. But Moreau would definitely be a starting type of guy. It wouldn't surprise me if the Saints do target a tight end in the draft rather than spend the money on a Foster Moreau and Austin Hooper. Irv Smith Jr. is also an unrestricted free agent. I'd love any of those guys with New Orleans, but they'd obviously cost more than what a draft pick would. And a lot of people feel like the tight ends in this draft are pretty deep. Dalton Kincaid from Utah is probably going to come off the board somewhere in the middle to early 20s. But a lot of people have Michael Mayer, the tight end from Notre Dame, coming off of the board around where the Saints pick. And outside of that, you got Darnell Washington from Georgia, Luke Musgrave from Oregon State, Iowa. As a kid, Laporta, Iowa puts out a tight end every single year. I have said several times so far that I do expect the Saints to come out of this draft with a big physical pass catcher, not necessarily a wide receiver, but either wide out or tight end, something to upgrade the physicality in the middle of that field. But again, if the Saints go out and get a Foster Moreau or even an Austin Hooper in free agency, then you won't see that kind of thing happen in the draft.
And I, that's interesting. The thing about the tight ends I like in this draft is this is a pretty deep draft as far as tight ends. I know people looking at the top tight ends and going, okay, after this, does it drop? How much does it drop? I see the Saints can possibly target a tight end in the second round. Yep. And, I'm looking at if Mayer or Meyer falls, the Georgia tight end is a possibility. Calvin going against his LSU guys. If you were a lot of tech, you'd want him. But it's I'm drawing a blank on some of these other guys' names, and forgive me. I have to go back and pull up some stuff. I was just getting ready to pull up my stats on tight ends, but the kid from Georgia is somebody I'm looking at in the second round if he falls that far. He's not the pass catching threat you want, but he's that big you can use on the goal line. He's somebody who can catch the ball better than a Troutman. Juwan Johnson can be somebody that can push more outside the numbers. He becomes more of a traditional tight end that we haven't seen since the Hobie Brenner days. And that's kind of how I look like that. That's tech too. Okay. All right, Calvin. I gotta say it for without Sean around anymore. Yeah. That's the thing. But I do think they are looking at a time because Michael Thomas's health right now, and you have two speedsters at receiver. You really need a physical, big-bodied guy to get those third down conversions. And we know Carr is a quarterback who likes to throw to tight ends too. So with that in mind, if the tight end market kind of dries up as far in the draft, with a lot of people taking tight ends, do you see the Saints targeting a big-bodied receiver in this draft?
Yeah, I do. I see them doing that, irregardless, because I don't think there's any question that when Michael Thomas is on the field, he is still dominant. But the issue is Michael Thomas being on the field. Now, he has up to $9 million in bonuses in incentive bonuses on the line. That tells you that he's going to make an effort to be on that field this year. But I think it's awful dangerous to count on someone who's only been able to play 10 games in the last 3 years. And because of that, you look at the receiving core. Other than that, like you said, Olave, a speedster, great run after the catch guy, good route runner, isn't as physical as Thomas. Shaheed, a burner, a big play threat, underrated route runner, according to what I saw last year, but he isn't a physical guy. Who do you have in that receiving core outside of Michael Thomas? Do you bring back Jarvis Landry? Doubtful, because he's been so beat up. Do you bring back Marquez Callaway? Doubtful, because he just hasn't been able to get separation. I don't even want to talk about the guy that wears number 10 because he's just that irrelevant. So, I do think that the Saints target a wideout in this draft. I think the people that have players like Zay Flowers from Boston College or Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee mocked to the Saints in the first or second round, I think that's foolhardy. because they are the exact type of player that Shaheed and Olave is. If the Saints target a receiver, don't get me wrong. If Jackson, the kid from Ohio State, or Quentin Johnson, the TCU kid, if they fall to them at 29 in the first round, they are both big physical receivers. That's going to be very interesting to see if the Saints pass that up. But assuming that they go earlier than 29, and I think they both will, then maybe a Cedric Tillman from Tennessee, a Bryce Wheaton, Ford Wheaton, from West Virginia, kid I love. Parker Washington from Penn State, smaller guy but very physical. It's those type of guys that I think the Saints will ultimately target in the draft.
Exactly, and that's where I was going to go with. You know, you have to look at a guy like Quentin Johnson. You know, somebody who is 6'4". We're looking for a guy who's 6'2" or larger, and you're looking for somebody who's got a big frame. Calvin's right. Zay Flowers, no, he's 5'10". You know, we're not looking for a speedster. We're looking for a guy who can be that physical box out. And I'm using a basketball term since it's March Madness. A box out guy, a guy who can shield the defensive back, reach out and get the ball. And that's why I was talking about tight ends just before that, because that's the kind of play you're looking for as a tight end too. You're looking for a big physical body that is a matchup problem for coverage from linebackers and is big and physical enough that can square off and block out cornerbacks and safeties. So I think that's what he's looking for. And again, going back to last season, where were the struggles the Saints were showing the most last year? And we were blaming the play calling. And the play calling was suspect, but I also look at it in terms of it was suspect because you probably didn't have the personnel to do the things that you wanted to do. And that is, you need a physical, big-bodied pass catcher to get those third and shorts. So, you know, I agree, Calvin, but they all kind of do in college. It's hard to find somebody who's a hands catcher in college. That's one of the things that really turned me on about Michael Thomas when he first came to the Saints, because I saw a hands catcher. They all tend to want to wait for that ball to come in so they can just cradle it. They don't want to just snatch it out the air. They're not aggressive. But I do agree with you, Calvin. But I think that's something you can coach him out of.
Another guy to watch, and the Saints were just at his pro day today. You know, don't read a lot into that. All these teams go to all these pro days. Xavier Hutchinson from Iowa State, 6'2", 203 guy, very, very physical receiver. He's another guy to watch. He's a mid to late day two prospect. But remember, Cody Burns, his first year, a wide receivers coach, his first year was with the Saints last year. Before that, he was at the University of Tennessee. I fully expect Cedric Tillman to be available at pick number 40. If the Saints address, say, an edge rusher or something on the defensive line in that first round, I do think that they turn around and go offense in the second round. Tillman had his best college production in 2021, which was Cody Burns' last year with Tennessee. So, if you're buying, and I'm not going to call it a conspiracy, but the Saints have clung to familiar faces and familiar feels all this offseason. Cedric Tillman, Cody Burns, there is certainly a familiar style there.
You know, and I like Cedric Tillman a lot. He is somebody I do have my eye on in the second round, because he's somebody I think that will be there in the second round. And he's not going to be very highly rated on the boards because, unfortunately, we live in an era now, because of Madden football, everyone's run 4-go patterns, 4-all-grow patterns, and it's all about speed. You're going to outrun everybody. You want to just like the coyote when he gets his Acme tennis shoes, chase the road runner. They want to see that flame trail, and he takes off running. And people forget the physical aspect of these things. These quarterbacks are running 4.4 and 4.3s too. It's just one of those things. Okay, we'll talk about this. I didn't want to set him off on this yet. Is Bob going to touch the Roger Goodell extension? Look, my attitude about this is Roger Goodell makes the league a lot of money, and he makes the owners very rich.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason to replace him in the owners' minds.
No.
We have not had a labor strike. In fact, we haven't had a player strike at all since the 80s. We have not had that corruption or challenge with the contract. Now going to go to stream sports network, and having basketball and baseball, and the NFL doesn't have to deal with any of that in major works. Making those guys a lot of money. They're not going to want to replace. So it sucks because I think we're getting an inferior product compared to what we got before. But he's making their money hand over fist. If they could get Dan Snyder out of Washington without him spilling the beans about the dark secrets of the league, then in the owner's mind, that's the chef kiss. That's a cherry on top. Especially if they can get a minority ownership of the Washington team. And Snyder there, oh my God. They want to put him in the Hall right now. Oh,
yeah.
Man. Yeah. So
listen, first of all, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm rooting for Dan Snyder as far as spilling the secret. I want him out, but I want him to cause as much chaos as he can on his way out. And as far as Goodell, you're right. He does make the owners money, and if the owners are making money, then the players are going to make money. So that's the bottom line. Is it an inferior product? Oh, absolutely. Most games are hard to watch now. All games are hard to watch now. And I had this conversation with it because obviously my feelings for Roger Goodell, I think, are worldwidely known. So there was actually a couple people that tagged me on both Facebook and Twitter when the announcement came out. I remember Kyle Mosley, our editor at Saints News Network. He asked in our staff chat. He asked if anyone was going to wanted to do the Goodell story yesterday, and I'm like, no, I refuse. The conversation I had with some of the people that tagged me is as simple as this. Of course, they were going to extend him. We're not going to stop watching the NFL. We're not going to stop buying tickets. We're not going to stop talking about it. We're not going to stop buying merchandise. All that puts money in their pockets. And as long as that's going to happen, it's a stupid business decision to go a different way. So nothing is going to change. In fact, it is going to change. I was going to say nothing is going to change, but no, it is going to change. It's going to continue to get worse because they continue to get away with it. They continue to get away with it because we keep watching, we keep buying, we keep talking. It's just, it's good business. Just like that, that crooked cat. And I just watched this the other day, so it's fresh in my mind. The evil captain, Lord Beckett on, Pirates of the Caribbean, the third one. When he betrayed Jack Sparrow and had the Royal Armada come down on the pirates, all he kept saying was, he goes, it's good, it's good business. That's Roger Goodell. Roger Goodell is Lord Beckett, and like I said, nothing is going to change. And I refuse to downplay the extension and put my own job in jeopardy. But Folks is like, yeah, until we collectively, and I include myself in this, until we collectively start doing something to put a dent in their pocketbooks, things are only going to get worse.
And it's almost impossible to put that dent in their pocketbooks because too many people play fantasy football. Too many people now participate in those DraftKings gambling. There's a demand for football. You've got Thursday night football, which I think is a joke, but you have Thursday night football. If they could figure out a way to get Tuesday night football, they do Tuesday night football too. They would like to have football on every day of the week if they could figure out how to do it.
Yep.
You got the NFL Network. When I first started watching NFL Network, it was a morning show, which was news, and then it was NFL films for the most part. And then at night was NFL replay. 3 or 4 games that were the best games of the game. It's not like that anymore. It's like ESPN now. It's all talk show. And then when it's not a talk show, it's the special NFL segments, I guess, that NFL Films does. But to see what you used to see on NFL Network, old shows, old football games and that kind of stuff, you have to go to NFL Plus. You have to subscribe to the NFL Network, and that makes the league more money because they know that's what people want to see. And you're right, gamblers make it worse. So when I don't even have this cable system anymore. When my cable company dropped the NFL Network because they weren't going to pay the extra money, I didn't miss it. I really didn't miss it. And, you've got NFL Red Zone, which basically is substituting for a lot of games. They'd rather watch NFL Red Zone. They can just see the scores because they're playing fantasy football. There you go. Pirates of the Caribbean reference right there. He's Davy Jones, very slimy, a bunch of and his ultimate goal is to have an international league, and he wants to have a team in Europe. He wants to have it either in London or in Germany. He'd like to get a team in Mexico City. He wants to make the league international. He'll never get it in Canada, but he'd like to get it in Canada. I don't doubt that was part of the thing about having Buffalo play some games in Toronto.
No doubt.
Well, let's gauge the NFL in Toronto. YouTube TV. I was just talking about that with the streaming services. They've already done it with Amazon, the Amazon Network, NFL Network. That's all things that Goodell wants to get done before he retires as commissioner, and the owners are all for it because that's more money. That's expanding the market. It's so far beyond anything even Pete Rozelle imagined. It's so hard when you go back and look at what the league was like. It's now 60 years ago, but what the league was like during when Pete Rozelle took over in the early 60s. 14 teams, regional telecasts. The Washington Redskins, for example, had the bulk of the South because they had individual agreements with southern cities to broadcast Redskins games because the northern market was saturated with the Giants and Philadelphia and so forth. So they just pointed this up downward, because there was no Atlanta team, there was no Florida teams, there were no, there wasn't even a team in Texas yet, not until the Texans arrived with the AFL, So Rozelle was the first one to come up with the idea of revenue sharing and packaging the NFL as one package to the networks and say, here we go, CBS, you get all the games and you get to play them across the entire country. That stuff, it's stuff we take for granted today, but back then it just never happened. And then Tagliabue came in. Tagliabue oversaw the invention of free agency. And once free agency happened, that increased, in his mind, increased the parity level. And we're seeing that today. That you in the 70s and even the early 80s. If you notice, the Super Bowl blowouts start ending once free agency really comes into play. You know, in the 80s and the 70s, it was, well, the 70s was the 6 tough kids on the block, same 16 all the time, one from each division in every Super Bowl. In the 80s, it became because they got all the quarterbacks in the AFC, the NFC became the league of defenses that were going to punish quarterbacks in the AFC. You know, it's one of the reasons why Jim Mora was so successful, because Jim Mora had a defense and had a fantastic record against the AFC.
Yeah.
You now get the parity, and you now have an even more expanded audience, because now your team is playing for something, because you're only a couple of a draft and a good free agency class away from being competitive again. Speaking of which, so far, if you had to put a grade on the Saints free agency, what kind of grade would you give them? I don't like doing this too often, but I'm asking only because people do this. To me, you got to include the draft, and it only matters once they play on the field. But how would you grade this free agency so far?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't like grading either, and I usually don't in my articles until after the draft is complete. But I'd honestly have to give the Saints an A right now. And it's because they're checking off all the boxes that they need to. Quarterback was by far the biggest need coming into the offseason. They got that done and then some. They not only got Derek Carr, the guy they wanted, but they have look throughout the league. Are there too many backup quarterbacks better than Jameis Winston, or at least more accomplished? Not many. Running back, complimenting running back to Alvin Kamara. Okay. We'll sign the guy who led the league in rushing touchdowns last year and had a career high 1,000-yard season. Defensive tackle, we lost our 2 starters. Less than 24 hours later, you have arguably an upgrade, by signing 2 more defensive tackles. You deepen your safety position by signing not 1, not 2, but 3 guys. On paper. So I say this tentatively and with a grain of salt, but on paper, you got to grade free agency as an A right now, because they checked off all their needs. And I include that in the players that they re-signed and reworked. They, you said it at the onset of the show. They were $59 million over the cap coming into the offseason. They have not released a single player, and they sit at now $17 million of salary cap space. On Tuesday, March 21st. That's a hell of a job at keeping not only keeping a championship core intact, but adding to it. So it's key, because they now go into the draft without being faced with the daunting task of, we need to get this position or we need to get that position. They can go according to their draft board and fill out their roster.
It's funny, we were talking about how badly we think the Bucs are handling this, but I'm with you. I'm giving them a B+, A- right now for the players that they did get, because like you said, they are checking all the boxes. Get me a linebacker that I feel confident enough that could start, but doesn't have to, and I'm probably going to push that up to an A. But they are checking all the boxes. A pass rusher would be nice, but you do have Peyton Turner, but you have Peyton Turner, and you're counting on him. You've got a new defensive line coach. Someone's got to turn him around. Someone's got to turn his motor on, because it needs to happen. The challenge is going to be, interestingly enough, I think the Carolina Panthers trying very hard. I've been talking with a lot of people about this, but the Carolina Panthers are showing right now they're expecting success right out the gate. And they're going to be a team, so far, it looks like it's going to be challenging the Saints to win this division. because they feel like Rule has wasted 3 seasons as a head coach, and because he's wasted those seasons, they can't afford for Frank Reich to have a slow start. They aggressively traded up for that first round pick, and they're signing a lot of players, including Andy Dalton. Um, would you say that the Carolina Panthers seem like the team that is trying to challenge the Saints as win the division?
On paper, absolutely. Not only with the free agent signings that they made, and the head coaching hire that they brought in, but anytime you put yourself in position, you can agree or disagree about what they had to give up to move up to number one, but they did it. And they did it specifically for a quarterback. I think it's very notable how aggressive the Atlanta Falcons are being this offseason as well, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But Atlanta still has questions at quarterback, still has liabilities at wide receiver. Carolina, at least according to the moves that they're making, they are trying to take care of every single spot on that roster. So yeah, on paper, because of the type of moves that they're making, I got to believe that the Carolina Panthers coming into 2023 are probably going to be on par with the Saints as far as the most competitive roster on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Ryan. The thing about Ryan Nielsen over there in Atlanta, they've got to undo a lot of stuff because that team's a small, fast defense, and this goes back to the Shanahan days and so forth. They've got a lot of things to correct on that defense. So because they are small and fast. So they've got a lot of work to do. They feel like Arthur Smith has a little more honeymoon grace. They can't afford for him to lose as badly again, but they are not in the we got to win now or got to show progress now mode like the Carolina Panthers are. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Atlanta. Real quick, so the stuff I've got in the Steve, I can't think of his last name, but the coach, the interim coach they have for Carolina, Steve Wilks.
Wilks.
Steve Wilks. Yeah, was Steve Wilks? Okay. Yeah, he almost made a case for him to get the head coaching job because he had turned that team around so much. But it also is a real indictment on how bad the former Baylor coach Matt Rule was for Carolina. And how much talent he was wasting with that roster, and no quarterback. I'm hearing the rumors that they're for who they want to take. You don't make that trade up unless you have a good idea who you want to take. Now you can sit there and say, "This is my quarterback 1, and this is 1A." We can have the discussion which one does it out, but you can't be going, well, which one do I want? This guy, or a third guy? You can't play that game if you're moving up to do that. So yeah. Real quick, the stuff I've been playing in the background, you can kind of see a little bit. The screen's a little too bleached out now, but Ricky Jackson's birthday was yesterday, so I've been playing a lot of highlights of Ricky Jackson, 83 Saints highlight. That is believe it or not, it's a 1990 highlight film, but it starts with a recap because it's the 25th anniversary of the Saints, the history of the Saints. I had the 91 highlight film up there, the 86 highlight film, the 87 highlight film. So, Ricky Jackson, it's 65 years old, and it feels like he was just playing for us not long ago. Really does.
He can't be 65 years old. He can't. I refuse to accept it.
um, and I'm very glad he's in the Hall of Fame because
Yeah.
you know how I talk about when we got Wes Chandler in '78. I said to my friends at the time, I was that age, and I'm like, yeah, we finally got one. We got a
Mhm.
Lynn Swan type of receiver in my mind. When Ricky Jackson showed up in '81, I was like, no, no, we have a different kind of player than this franchise has ever had. And if Mean Joe Green was the start of the Steelers not being losers anymore, to me, Ricky Jackson, it did take a few years, granted, but Jackson was the kind of player that you brought in and you were just like, okay, not the kind of, this is not a loser. Well, this guy's only going to be here for a couple of years and just a total waste of a player. You could see how special he was the minute he showed up in the field. What um what are some of your favorite Ricky Jackson memories, if you have any?
The face mask, in my opinion, the most intimidating face mask in the history of the NFL. Um, but yeah, and remember, yeah, Ricky played for the University of Pittsburgh. Yeah, so
Mhm.
yeah, I was little, but I remember watching him and Hugh Green, as bookends, for a very very good Panthers team, that also had Dan Marino and
Mhm.
a bunch of players on offense too. Uh, Ricky Jackson, like you said, he became the face of the New Orleans Saints. And just even before Jim Mora got here, uh, the Saints were becoming known as a physical smash mouth team, that were going to beat you up defensively. And you just had to hang in there and wait for the Saints offense to make enough mistakes so you won the game. The defense was viewed that with that much respect under Ricky Jackson, and I mean, just his strength, his brute force coming off of the edge when he rushed quarterbacks. Pat Swilling and the USFL folding brought in Vaughn Johnson and Sam Mills. Obviously, the Dome Patrol, the most intimidating unit of any in the history of the NFL. But Ricky Jackson was the face of that unit. I think Sam Mills was long overdue getting into the Hall of Fame. It's a travesty that Pat Swilling isn't in the Hall of Fame. Uh, but Ricky Jackson was the player that fueled all of that. He was the veteran presence that, like you said, had already been there a few years by the time those other guys got there.
Mhm.
For not only the Dome Patrol and that defense, but Bear, Dalton Hilliard, and the rest of those guys on offense. Ricky Jackson doesn't get enough credit for being the veteran leader that he was to kind of bring that team all together, while still playing at a high level. I mean, like he came into the league in '81. Uh, Probably would have been the defensive rookie of the year had it not been for some guy, some guy named Lawrence Taylor who was pretty good too. Uh, but Ricky played at that Hall of Fame level right up through his retirement with San Francisco in 1995. And
Yeah.
that's a long time to play a high level of defensive football, especially in that era. So, I mean, it's the longevity and just the sheer brute force that he played the game of football with that will always be my lasting memory.
It's amazing too. He not only he lasted into the second round, but he was the Saints' second pick in the second round in
Yeah.
1981. Their pick that they got at the top of the draft, in the second round was Russell Gary, the safety, and Ricky Jackson was the guy for the pick from the San Diego Chargers when they sent Chuck Muncie
Hmm.
to the Chargers in 1980. It was for a second round pick, and that turned out to be Ricky Jackson. So a lot of people talk about what if the Saints would have taken Lawrence Taylor in the first round as the number one overall pick instead of George Rogers, and then get Ricky Jackson later on. They don't get Ricky Jackson if they
No.
take Lawrence Taylor, but you would have had to have a different coach than Bum Phillips to be that kind of decision. because Bum was going to recreate the Houston Oilers in New Orleans, and he was going to make George Rogers his Earl Campbell, and he was going to build it around a strong defense, great special teams, and your offense wins the ball by controlling the clock and a power running game, and that's just how they were going to be built. Well, it's funny, you got George Rogers, Frank Warren, Hobie Brenner, Hokie Gajan in the 10th round. You got Jim Wilkes in the 12th round, and we don't even have drafts that go that far. Ricky Jackson, Russell Gary. So the 81 draft class built that team for the Bum Phillips era. Then the 86 draft class built the Jim Mora team. You put those two classes together plus the USFL influx, that's why the team was winning by 1987. Because 86, that's Dalton Hilliard, that's Ruben Mays, that's Pat Swilling, Barry Word, Jim Dombrowski. That's that class. So yeah, it's really something. You take those two classes combined within 5 years of each other, and that's why the Saints turned around. And having Tom Benson as an owner with a good coach in Jim Mora, a good GM in Jim Finks, although Finks was a little past his prime by the time he got to New Orleans. His idea of building a team was not in the late 80s, early 90s mentality. He was very much trying to build a team like he built out of Chicago and he built with Minnesota. I'm keeping you way over time, I know, Bob. Real quick, what do you have going on for the Bayou Blitz tomorrow night?
Alan, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is, every time, and we do it here too, every time you start to make plans, okay, we're going to move on and start talking about the draft, then the Saints go and pull off another free agency move. So obviously we're going to break down, what the Saints, have done in free agency, what they still might be able to accomplish in free agency. But I'm hoping to be able to talk a little bit more in depth in the draft. I realize we still have about a month, 5 weeks, 5 weeks away from the draft. But the fact that none of us in the media have really written a lot about it, and you've seen very few mock drafts from us, that tells you how busy the Saints have been this off season. We're just going to kind of play it by ear. Depends on what the news day brings us. But definitely do a free agency recap and hopefully start to get into the draft a little bit more in depth.
Right. I mean, we're already an hour and a half in, and one of the things I want to talk about at the beginning of the show is Ricky Jackson's birthday, and I had to push it all the way to the end because of free agency. So I appreciate you staying up with me. It's 10:30 his time over there, 10:50 his time, 9:50 my time over here. Thank you guys for sticking with us for so long. I sit and scramble trying to figure out topics to write about or talk about on the show, and the Saints keep giving us more and more stuff. So, like Bob said, we never know what tomorrow is going to bring. Jim, that was a great view you had with Jim a couple weeks ago. I did mean to tell you about that too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for sticking with. Thank you guys for watching the show. We appreciate you as always, and we'll see you next time on Under the Dome. Good night, everybody.